Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And now, with no further ado, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. There's really only one place to start tonight, and that's the unprecedented scenes or events over the last 24 hours. Just to give a bit of context, we'll take a little step back. As we know, after the last elections, a so-called unity government was formed between Benny Gantz's Blue and White and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party. There was a coalition agreement signed where one would serve first, that would be Netanyahu, and then Gantz would serve. There'd be equity in government positions and on votes. There would have to be agreement on significant votes. The basic law, which is quasi-constitutional, Israel does not have a constitution, a written constitution, but it has what's called basic laws, which are quasi-constitutional, and therefore there's a higher threshold than regular laws to pass and to overrule, et cetera, et cetera. And it was changed to allow for this unique situation where there'd be two prime ministers, equity and equality in government decisions, et cetera. And as we know, the government didn't really last very long. And we went to the fourth elections, but the government, until a new government is passed, remains in place, and the coalition agreement remains in place. What happened was Avi Nissenkorn, who was Blue and White's justice minister, according to the coalition agreement, Blue and White would get the justice minister in the coalition negotiations. Avi Nissenkorn was that justice minister for the majority of the coalition's life. But he resigned in the lead up to the last elections, the recent elections. He decided to jump ship and move to another party. In the end, that party didn't even run in the elections. It was Ron Chaldehi's party. And as we know, they didn't even run. So Avi Nissenkorn basically was left in no position. When that happened, the position of justice minister then reverted to Benny Gantz. In Israel, you're allowed to hold multiple positions, at least for a certain amount of time. But it was only supposed to be interim. It was, I believe, 3 months. That 3 months ran out on April 1st. And since April 1st, Israel's not had a justice minister, which was quite a remarkable situation considering everything that's going on. At that point, as you know, we know from a few weeks ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu's future was in the ascendancy. There was a lot of optimism and confidence from his camp that he would continue being Prime Minister. He'd be able to put together the next government and the coalition, et cetera, et cetera. So he saw no particular reason to give Benny Gantz to continue with the reins of the Justice Ministry because there was many decisions, whether ideological or personal, that Benny Gantz could take and even did take, which would be against Netanyahu's interest, either whether on an ideological basis, maybe he would be appointing certain justices that were more from the left of center. From a personal point of view, it could be that he would do things or not do things which would hurt Netanyahu's case, or Netanyahu himself wanted to be able to appoint and replace some of the key figures in his ongoing investigations and trial, the Attorney General. So basically, it was left open. There were rumblings from the justice system that he should replace. Should appoint a new justice minister, but it's something that could be easily ignored. Ironically or not, considering everything that's going on in Israel, again, the coronavirus had its say. What was happening is a ruling had run out or needed to be ruled again that prisoners were being brought to court as opposed to, basically before it ran out, prisoners cases were allowed to do video conferencing for their trials instead of actually being brought to court, obviously because of safety and health issues. But that whatever ruling, temporary ruling was running out, And it was coming to a point where hundreds, I don't know exactly how many, maybe thousands, of non-vaccinated prisoners would be brought into courthouses and potentially infect many people. And then it was decided that the justice system would kick in and say, well, we need a decision, we need a justice minister. Don't forget, all during this time, because there was no equity in the cabinet, basically the cabinet was not allowed to meet. So we didn't have the security cabinet meeting on issues to do with Iran, to issues to do with Hamas or whatever it is. We didn't have the coronavirus. There were many also other decisions that were allowed to slip. They weren't extended. I mean, basically we had, to a certain extent, a non-functioning government, but the Supreme Court in Israel ruled, they were asked to by an NGO, Movement for Quality Government, basically asked them to rule on forcing the government to appoint a justice minister, which they did. And they said the government had 48 hours to do so. A meeting of the government was organized. And on the agenda was one thing, to appoint Benny Gantz as the next justice minister. That didn't happen. Or actually, there was a vote and it was voted against. It was voted down because the whole Netanyahu bloc voted against it. What then happened was something pretty unprecedented. Interestingly enough, just before, I'm leading up to it, don't worry, one of the Likud ministers, the government meetings these days happen on Zoom, who didn't understand that his voice wasn't on mute, said, oh, I've got a feeling that the prime minister will just throw some random Likud name into the mix to see what happens. And lo and behold, a few minutes later, Prime Minister Netanyahu, out of nowhere, decided to say, okay, let's have a vote on Ofer Kunis to be the next justice minister. Not only was the fact that that wasn't in the agenda, it actually went against the coalition agreement, which went against the basic law, the quasi-constitutional law. And the Attorney General, who is on these government meetings to be able to give a legal opinion on various matters, said this is unconstitutional, this is illegal, and this vote should not take place. Netanyahu decided to have the vote anyway, and Ofer Kunis won a majority, and Netanyahu considered him to be the next justice minister. The Attorney General then asked the Supreme Court for an injunction on this. They basically froze it and said Israel does not have a justice minister, and they were going to make a decision today. And in fact, they were going to have it live broadcast, which is also unprecedented, really to show what was going on. The president got involved, lots and lots of people got involved. The media went crazy about it, because here was literally someone who was upholding the whole government system, the basic laws, the quasi-constitutional nature of the state of Israel, the government, everything for his personal whims, let's say. And as we were getting closer to a court decision, in the end, Netanyahu balked. He basically retreated from his position, and he said to Benny Gantz, I will appoint you, let's have a government vote and you'll be appointed the next justice minister. So what basically happened? I mean, this sounds like a relatively technical, bureaucratic decision, but it wasn't. It was a lot more than that. The media from the right and the left, the parties from the right and left really slammed this, because this really seemed to just go beyond anything that's happened before. Here was a prime minister who basically wasn't adhering to what he himself had signed, what he had agreed to, what he had voted on, and basically decided that the rule of law in Israel was less relevant than his personal political interest. This is how it was playing out. Most importantly, I would say, is what this proved is that Netanyahu is flailing. He has 6 more days of his mandate, and he's no closer to forming a government. There still remains a possibility he will do, but the policy, that possibility seems to decrease by the day, and the so-called change camp is certainly, the momentum has moved. You know, we talked last week, the momentum has moved across. Well, there's massive momentum now against the Netanyahu government, and possibly for a change government. As I said, in 6 days, the president will have to decide whether he's going to give someone in the change camp the mandate to form a government, or just throw it to the Knesset, where they have a certain amount of time to receive 61 signatures for one particular person. But this Netanyahu maneuver, it's now been framed as the April maneuver. Basically, what it did, and I think this really speaks to the panic of the prime minister at the moment, because Prime Minister Netanyahu, as I've said many times, he knows how to do this. He's a strategist when others are tacticians. He's usually playing a few steps ahead. This was a major strategic mistake. It may have tactically looked good for him or not looked good for him, but maybe achieved a situation where he could then choose one of his allies to be justice minister, and as I said, maybe replace some of the people in the system, et cetera, et cetera. But what it did more than anything else is it gave a massive boost to the change government, because what they now saw, even if they doubted it before, here was a person who would not adhere or listen or keep the word of himself, his own written agreements, coalition agreements. And every other day he's offering the rotation of prime minister to someone different. So far, according to media reports, he's offered it to Benny Gantz, he's offered it to Gideon Saar, he's offered it to Naftali Bennett. And here he was basically going against everything that he promised before. So what that did on a strategic level, it really gave momentum to the change camp and say, this is a person who cannot be trusted. He can offer me the earth, and then the day after I sign, he'll renege on it. So what that did is it really gave some wind in the sails of the change camp. Today, we saw some unprecedented meetings. We saw a right-wing religious leader, Naftali Bennett, sitting down with an Islamist Party leader, Mansour Abbas. And apparently, by all measures, it was a very good conversation. They say the two really got on. They were well prepared for the meeting. They talked on very practical issues, and that could be another obstacle potentially to the change camp forming a government. The next obstacle will be, well, there's a few obstacles. First of all, Benny Gantz today, interestingly on the media, he was asked again and again and again, do you rule out sitting again with Prime Minister Netanyahu in a unity government, this time where you would go first in rotation? And he refused to say he wouldn't. Now, it could be that's just a negotiating tactic, or it could be this is a person who's made a mistake once, and he could well be making the same mistake again. The other important thing to look out for is who, if President Rivlin is going to give the mandate to someone else, who is it going to be? Is it going to be Lapid, or is it going to be Bennett? Now, this isn't just a sort of an irrelevant point, because there's talk that they will both be prime ministers, Naftali Bennett first, Lapid second. But the point of who to give the mandate, again, we've got to stress this because we've talked about this before, is who then controls the Arrangements Committee in the Knesset. And as we've talked before, at the moment, Miki Zohar of the Likud, a very close ally of Netanyahu, he's the chairman of the Arrangements Committee, but the Arrangements Committee in itself has a majority for the change camp. Once the mandate goes over to Lapid or Bennett, whoever gets that then controls the Arrangements Committee. If it's Bennett, then there is a possibility he could still allow certain votes to go through that would be good for Netanyahu, at least use this as leverage against some of his potential partners in the change camp. If it's Lapid, we can kiss goodbye to any idea of passing direct elections or any of these other things that would be very favorable to Netanyahu. So it is very important, and we can see that even though all the major players in the change camp are meeting, there's been a lot of, some of these leaders and their advisors have basically been telling the media who's going to be which position, even though some of the more left-wing parties are upset about certain policies and decisions that appear to be made, but a lot of this is jockeying for influence and leverage. But it does seem that the negotiations are pretty advanced. There is talk that they would need to be or will be finished at the weekend or maybe early next week, which would be in time then to be able to go to the president and say this person deserves the mandate, and that person would then, according to them, would be able to then put together a government. Again, we have to stress that the change government as it is only has 58 seats. So what would happen? It could, one situation is that they rely on a party like Ram on the outside. The other, and this is something that's starting to happen, is they're going to try and have the ultra-Orthodox parties abstain on the vote to form a government in the hope of perhaps them coming in a year and a half time to the government to give it a little bit more breadth to it. But they say that their trade-off for that is ensuring that Avigdor Lieberman would not serve as finance minister, which apparently is a position that's been promised to him and one that certainly he seeks. And there is talk of even the ultra-Orthodox coming in at the beginning and leaving Avigdor Lieberman and perhaps Meretz outside, and that would have enough to form a government. So we'll have to wait and see exactly what happens. Lots more happening, but it's clear that this week there is great momentum against Netanyahu. Netanyahu only has 6 days. Again, I've said it many times, don't bet against him. I'm sure he's balancing a lot of things. He's trying a lot of different suggestions. It could be, if it comes to it, it could be he's prepared to give up the first rotation. But as we know, he'll need at least 2 parties. Naftali Bennett isn't enough because that only gives him 59. So he needs to bring in at least 2 parties. And the question is, if you need 2 parties, which one do you give the rotation to? So these are all questions that Netanyahu has to deal with. But as I said, it's looking less and less likely that he'll continue, but you never bet against Bibi. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you so much. So the first question is, what does the typical Israeli citizen think about the election situation in their country, the difficulty to come up with a government? Are they turned off by the situation or a little excited for the need for another election?
Very few people are excited about the possibility of a 5th election. Israelis are fed up. Unfortunately, according to all polls, not enough that they're changing their position. All polls basically speak to, if there was, again, a poll is a poll, but if, the polls that we see, if they show that if there were elections on that particular day and over the last week, then we'd still have the same, deadlock as we have today. So it's clear that we're not in a situation where enough of Netanyahu's Likud supporters have deserted him. And those who are against Netanyahu have not been deserted. There's always a little bit of movement within the blocks, but the situation hasn't changed. But certainly Israelis, every poll that I've seen, overwhelmingly do not want a 5th election. And I think that is allowing for these sort of, let's say, quote unquote, strange relationships between right and left, between, religious right-wing leaders and Islamist leaders. Because they know that, and they've stated this many, many times, that the people do not want another election, and they're prepared for to see a lot of things happen just to prevent that from happening.
Thank you so much. And you brought up the Islamist Party. What are the major pros and cons of including the Islamist Party in the formation of a new government?
Well, firstly, it's unlikely that they'll actually be in the government. What both sides are talking about is that they'll support them from the outside, because as we know, a government needs 61. Neither side have 61. Both sides are talking, not openly, because no one wants to talk at this point openly about being supported by Ram, but they're both playing behind the scenes very intensively. And we saw, by the way, this week, I didn't mention that Likud created a committee, gave Mansour Abbas the chairmanship of it. I can't remember the exact title of it, but basically to deal with Arab society. And it was a great win for Abbas. We saw these pictures of him hugging Likud leaders, which certainly put the change camp a little bit into disarray. But he's been meeting with both sides regularly. Listen, at the end of the day, the fact that we will have a minority government is not good for stability and governability in Israel. I personally, my view is whatever side actually wins out, if any side wins out, we'll have elections within a year anyway. I don't see how a minority government exists and survives. I mean, both sides have been saying that what happens the first time Israel needs maybe to have to do something militarily against Gaza, will Ram sit comfortably, even if it's on the outside, supporting such a government? Even any sort of moves, would it be able to take down illegal structures or infrastructure in Arab villages, in Arab areas? This is something which, is a major problem. But with having a government reliant on a party like Ram, would it be able to do would it be able to take such a step? So that's obviously a great disadvantage. The advantage is, for the first time in history, you'd have a significant Arab party at least wielding a certain amount of power. I think that's a positive thing because it can show what the Arab leadership and the Arab population can do when it works with the government and the state rather than against it. So I think those are some of the pros and cons of potentially Ram not being in the government, because I don't think anyone's talked about that, although it remains entirely possible at some point, but even being supportive on the outside.
Thank you. That actually brings us to our next question. If Ram Party supports minority government from the outside, what might happen if Israel goes to war again with Gaza?
I mean, as I said, I think it would be very, very difficult for a government to take such steps. Although, on the other hand, it wouldn't, because, I think you'd find a consensus amongst the Zionist parties, the mainstream parties, if we needed to go to war with Hamas or one of the other terrorist groups. There's pretty much, when it comes to these situations, you have all support from all the major parties. So in that situation, you would certainly have a certain amount of unity. You can't imagine Likud voting against, not that there's necessarily a vote because it's usually a government decision, but not supporting them. You would find, as you do with every sort of operation like that, you find wall-to-wall support from the opposition, again, except for the extreme left or the Arab parties. You find wall-to-wall support for the steps that Israel would need to take.
Understood. Thank you. And is there any chance that one or more MKs from Likud would jump ship and join the change camp?
That's an interesting question. The first thing that needs to be said is, according to the law, if less than a third came, they would not be able to run again afterwards. They'd basically be, hurting their career, their personal career. It's certainly possible. If the change camp does form a government, it will certainly put a lot of pressure within the Likud, either defectors, which I think is less likely, but I think what's more likely is there'll be great pressure inside to replace Netanyahu. Netanyahu is in a good position, Likud. Even if he does lose the mandate, even if he does lose the prime ministership, he still controls vital committees within the Likud hierarchy. He still has a lot of loyalty, but certainly that would ebb. But a lot would depend on what the so-called big names would come and do. A lot of the backbenchers are very supportive of Netanyahu. They need him. He repays them with positions, etc. But some of the bigger names that, Yuli Edelstein, Yisrael Katz, Nir Barkat, who's probably, according to every poll that I've seen, the most popular leader after him. There's also Chaim Bibas, who's the mayor of Modi'in, who's a very powerful Likud figure, and it was already said that he would like to replace Netanyahu. So there would be tremendous pressure within Likud, but it wouldn't be an easy thing to do because, again, as we saw this week, Netanyahu still wields significant power within Likud. This week, he asked for the Likud Central Committee to vote to allow him to bring in another party to run on a joint list in the next elections. Now, that was just to give him leverage in negotiations, or maybe there is a party that he's signing with. If there is, then he's kept it very well secretive. But what it does is give him leverage. But the fact that he was able to pass it with a massive majority shows that he still wields tremendous influence. But if he was weakened by someone else coming into the prime minister's residence, and he would then go to opposition, he would be weakened. But to what extent remains to be seen.
Thank you. And can you just discuss a little further the pros and cons of Lapid versus Bennett being mandated for the government, forming the government?
So again, the only real difference, if again they are negotiating together and everything is being done in good faith, the only real difference to one of them getting it over the other one is the fact that whoever holds the mandate also controls the leadership of the Arrangements Committee. And as we said, the Arrangements Committee controls the agenda of the Knesset, which means whoever controls that basically will decide what laws come up before a government's been formed. Now, there's a lot of laws that would like to be passed on both sides. On the change camp, they would like to pass a law which would invalidate Netanyahu from even running in future elections. Netanyahu would certainly like to see what he's floated is direct elections, where we wouldn't go to parliamentary elections, but just a direct elections on the prime minister's role. So those are very important. If Lapid gets it, then anything even close to what Netanyahu wants is going to be out of the window. And in fact, Netanyahu would be more at risk. But if Naftali Bennett gets it, then, first of all, he's more to the right. He's more ideologically aligned with the right-wing party. So there are certain things that he wouldn't do that Lapid would. But it basically gives them significant power in the Knesset and over the Knesset agenda over the coming weeks until a government was formed.
And I'm sure it's too early to say, but is the president leaning any which way?
I mean, it probably will be out. It will be the decision of the president, but I'm sure when it comes to it, they'll come together. I don't think they'll go against each other, towards the president. I think they'll come in a position, but at the moment, there's negotiations of both are trying to get that leverage, trying to get that position. But I think when it comes to it, they won't, they'll come as a unified position. I don't see they'll go against each other and see who gets more votes, because I don't think that'll work out too well. And it could be then the president will just say, well, there's obviously no unity on this side, so I'm just going to throw it to the Knesset, because that was the original feeling when he was, let's say, forced to give to Netanyahu the first mandate. There was a feeling that he would then he wouldn't give a second mandate. He would just then throw it to the Knesset. But now it seems, at least according to media reports, that he's moved back from that, and he is prepared to give a second candidate a chance to form a government.
Thank you. And going back a little bit here, are there signs that Ram is modifying its anti-Zionist platform?
Not officially, certainly. Its language, at least from the top, let's say from Mansour Abbas, in Hebrew at least, again, seems to be far more moderate. But the manifesto of the party has not been changed, at least to the best of my knowledge, and I don't think there's any calls for it. Whether that would need to be done, whether that would be something that would be asked for whoever the forming government. The problem is at the moment that Ram has the leverage. So there's no real interest for other parties to make it a problem for Ram. They want to give Ram whatever they want at this point. But Ram, Mansour Abbas has shown that he's a clever politician. He knows how to play the game. That's why he's held a few recent press conferences, and he's gone a little bit further each time with his moderate positions and how he wants to be part of society and he wants to work with it. And for him, Arab society needs to be looked after and not fight against the state and whatever. Again, I'm not using his exact words, but certainly his verbal comments in Hebrew have been far more moderate than we've seen in recent months or even years. But there's no official change to the party's platform. And I don't think that will happen at the moment, but possibly in the future, especially if it seems to work for them, that the more they moderate, the more they get from the state, because that's certainly important for their society and also important for Mansour Abbas and his party politically going forward.
Thank you. And our last question of the day is there any response to the news that John Kerry leaked classified information about Israelis' activities in Syria to Iran?
I mean, there was a little bit of reaction, nothing official, obviously, because John Kerry is still he is part of the new administration. But certainly it's not something that would be seen behind closed doors very kindly and very likely. But there's been no official reaction to that. But obviously with all the sensitivities surrounding the discussions of a possible return of the US to the JCPOA, there's all these sort of leaks and trying to, again, create leverage between the parties. Israel is trying to do as much as possible to try and put its position forward. As we didn't talk about it, but we see senior Israeli security officials, National Security Advisor, who met with the American National Security Advisor today. We see the head of the Mossad, Chief of Staff in the US, really trying to signal Israel's position, and not just Israel, by the way. We know that senior US administration officials are coming to the region. They're not necessarily coming to Israel because they're also gauging and feeling out what some of the other allies in the region, mostly the pragmatic Sunni nations, feel about the JCPOA, although a potential American return. And obviously they're not going to hear necessarily good things because they are as worried about the Iran nuclear situation as Israel is, in many cases, maybe even a little bit more. So we're at a very sensitive time. The talks in Vienna are ongoing. Israel and many of its allies, let's say, or those on the same side of it as the region, are certainly trying to get their message across because there is a feeling in the region that America wants to get back to the agreement, whether it's going to be the JCPOA or the JCPOA 2.0, which people are talking about, perhaps a slightly upgraded agreement. It's clear that the Americans want it, but it's also important that Israel and its other allies in the region are giving its opinion forward, and that's really where the focus is. And while there was certainly interest what Kerry did or didn't say, it's more of a sideshow to the real important issue.
Understood. Well, thank you so much. We've come so close to our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us. For our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Hassan Da'i discussing the Ayatollah's Americans. Thank you all again and have a great day.